So happy Thursday, everyone. Happy day after Women's Day. This is the attendance register. So we have a lot of computer scientists here today. These are the slides from today. And I have some leftover slides from last time, if anybody's interested, about writing research papers. Does anyone have any questions or comments before we start? I always ask that question, but nobody ever has. Well, that's not true. Every once in a while somebody has a question or a comment.
What's the difference between introduction and motivation?
What's the difference between introduction and motivation? So that's about the last lecture. Yeah. So the first section of all your research papers, or a typical research paper, is called introduction. And what I was saying last time is that word introduction is not very useful. Like, just if you're reading a paper and you see that the first section is called introduction, that's not very informative. There's no information value there. Like, you know it's the introduction. It's the start. It could also, you could just cross out that word and you wouldn't lose anything. But motivation is very informative because so when you're writing the introduction, the word that you want to be thinking of when you're writing is motivation. Why are we working on this topic? Like, that's what your introduction is about. It's actually the motivation behind what you're doing. Why are you doing what you're doing? Why is this topic important? And what are the unsolved problems, for example? And what problems are you trying to solve? And what's your contribution? So it's the motivation. So that's why it says introduction and motivation. And when I remember, I always for our own papers, when I remember, I always add introduction and motivation to that first, because you kind of have to have the word introduction there. You kind of have to. Because you have to conform on some level to the standard practice. But it's better to write introduction and motivation. Does that answer the question, hopefully? Yeah. So introduction is not a very helpful word, really. Any other questions or comments? That's a big topic. The writing research papers is a big topic, and it's a never-ending topic. Like, we're all still improving our skills in that topic. It never really ends, which is one thing that makes it so exciting. Any other questions or comments? So today you'll notice it's a big shift in the sort of the subject matter. So we had an introduction lecture, and it talked about how to conduct very fruitful meetings or productive meetings. And then we had a lecture about reading research papers, how to read them. Then we talked about how to do a survey, and then how to write a paper. So this is quite a shift. This starts to talk about the data analysis part. It's no longer necessarily about writing things and reading things. It's more about trying to understand your data and do things. Right? And it's called Visual Data Analysis and Visualization in Science. So let's jump in. And if anybody does have questions or comments, just interrupt me at any time. It's fine. It's boring if I'm the only one that does all the talking. It's not that. Maybe boring's not the right word. So, this slide is called The Age of Digital Enlightenment. I think everybody's mostly kind of familiar with the Age of Enlightenment, the classic Age of Enlightenment, which after this notion spreads, the Age of Digital Enlightenment, the original Age of Enlightenment will be called the Age of Analog Enlightenment. It will be retroactively renamed. So the Age of Enlightenment, a lot of people say it happened in the 18th century, around there, and it was a special kind of evolution in knowledge centered in Europe, right? It was characterized by the scientific method, the promotion of this thing called the scientific method, a shift in values from the collective to individual freedom, and the separation of church and state, for example. So there was a big shift in knowledge evolution, and somebody decided to call that big shift the Age of Enlightenment. Well, we're going through something like that right now, except it's called the Age of Digital Enlightenment, and it's also a big shift in knowledge evolution. And everybody knows about it, but I don't know if there's a name that's been given to it yet, because I think those names come after the whole thing has happened, and that those descriptions are retroactively fitted onto the historical time period. But my claim is that we're in the middle of something called the Age of Digital Enlightenment, which is also a shift in knowledge. And this is what it looks like. The Age of Enlightenment doesn't have a nice diagram, but the Age of Digital Enlightenment has a nice diagram, a description, right? Because we're in a visualization lecture. You can keep that open if you want. You know, it's just yeah. So, what is the Age of Digital? What is the Age of Digital Enlightenment? It's this pattern of knowledge evolution right here. So it starts with a real-world challenge. We all have these challenges in the physical or the real world, right? And we might be trying to build something. We might be trying to carry out some sort of an experiment to produce some new results. Or we might be able we might be carrying out an experiment to reproduce somebody else's results. We might be trying to build software. We might be trying to travel or collect data about some spatial, like maybe the melting glaciers or climate change or global warming or what have you. So the Age of the Digital Enlightenment starts off with a real-world challenge, and this is something we're all familiar with because we've all had real-world challenges that we want to solve, right? And for every real-world challenge, there's for most real-world challenges, there's a physical or it can also be called an analog approach to solving that or addressing that challenge. So if we want to build an airplane, we can physically put parts together and build an airplane, right? That's a physical approach to building an airplane or a boat or whatever real-world challenge we're trying to address. But sometimes, if we're solving a real-world challenge, the physical approach has limitations. For example, in the plane, what's the problem with building a real-world plane? It's expensive. Yeah. You guys, if I asked you to build a plane, you probably say, "Oh, that's not possible," right? Because it's not for you guys. As an individual, it's not possible. You could build a model plane. Even that could be If it flies, that's a different question. But because building a real plane is too expensive, the physical approach, right? We decide it's too expensive in this particular case. It doesn't matter which real-world challenge you're trying to solve, by the way. We start to jump to a digital solution. So that's what this dashed line is. This is a crossing from the real world or the analog world in which we live, breathe, into the digital world. So if I asked you to build a plane, a digital plane, you might be able to do that. A computer model of a plane. You could actually do that. You could Google how to do it, learn how to use the software, the CAD software, and build a digital plane. It's possible, right? Dylan, you did that, right? More or less. Right? You can get a degree at Swansea University on how to do that and do it. Or take a few classes. So that's the next, and everybody knows about the real world challenges, the physical approaches. Everybody knows that a lot of physical solutions are not feasible. And everybody knows about digital solutions now. That's the age we're in right now. Everybody knows this. Everybody knows, oh, I can't do this in the physical world. I know there's a digital solution though. We just need an app that gets this done. We just need a piece of software that gets this job done. We can do it in the digital world. All we need is software. The solution is software, right? So we use software to build airplanes before they're built in the real world. But the problem with that is all these digital solutions that we're all very familiar with, because we all use digital solutions every day. You can't do anything without touching software nowadays, right? All of these digital solutions collect lots and lots of data. And this is the challenge characterized by the age of digital enlightenment. And this is where we are in our understanding. This is the challenge, and that's why it's in red, right? This is the challenge in the real world. This is the challenge in the digital world. And this is something we're all starting to understand right now. We're in the middle right now at this stage. We sort of know, I think most people in this room and most people know that there's an endless amount of data being generated, but the amount of information, valuable information that we're able to extract from that data is very limited. And we're not very good at it. And never mind knowledge and wisdom. Right, that's a really even more extreme case. And the lecture, so today's lecture is how to get from this data chaos to what we call visualization cosmos. So which is understanding, creating understanding from this data chaos, right? How do we address this problem of data chaos? So we can go from chaos to the cosmos with something called visualization or visual data analysis. And that's the age of digital enlightenment. Sounds good, doesn't it? So, and it's characterized by these steps. Start with a problem, a goal, or a challenge. Propose physical or analog solutions. The physical solutions are usually too expensive. Sometimes they're just impossible, right? So we look to a digital solution to that problem, which is a combination of hardware and software. The hardware is usually readily available, though, right? We already have computers. We already have phones. So the software is usually the limiting factor, but digital solutions lead to data chaos. Right? That's the challenge that we're facing right now. Is the attendance register all signed? Everybody signed that? So these are just some examples of people that are collecting data for a living. You know, they enter a full-time job and they just collect data. That's sort of what this list is, right? CFD engineers, physicists, astronomers, they run experiments, they perform simulations that generate endless amounts of data. They collect images. We have marine biologists, biochemists, collecting data in the hopes that they will solve their real world problems. It doesn't matter where you look, which discipline you turn to, which company you're talking to, it's almost always the same challenge. You have psychologists and sociologists, criminologists collecting survey data, years and years worth of survey data. That's also at Swansea University. Sports scientists studying endless hours of videos and events. You have humanities people with an endless supply of data. So the library, right? We're right next to a library with I don't know how many millions of books. It's all text data, right? You have government councils. And of course we have people in this room collecting data as part of their PhD. Anybody here collecting data as part of their PhD? You guys want to tell us what is the data you're collecting? So we have people in here from geography. Somebody with a physical geography. Okay. Mathematics, physics. How about the physicists? Are any of the physicists collecting data? No, you're not running any experiments, not doing any simulations. It's theoretical, trying to write proofs. Okay, this is still some of the material here will be very applicable for the theoretical people as well that try to avoid data. So those are some examples. And part of the age of the digital enlightenment is that people like to collect. This is also a factor. This is like a human nature for some reason. I don't know why people like to collect. I can't say that I'm less guilty of trying to collect. I'm trying to undo that physical collection of things. But people like to collect. And I think it's related to like an instinctive survival mechanism, maybe. Like they just think, oh, if I collect things, it will help me survive longer. I think that's why people love to collect, right? But everybody collects stuff, like selfies, for example, or photos, or videos, and stuff like that. Okay, so we're going to talk about visual data analysis and visualization. So what is that good for? It's good for going the next step in the knowledge of the pattern of knowledge evolution, going from the data chaos to the visualization cosmos to make sense of the data, right? To derive useful information, useful knowledge, things that we can use, because raw data is not necessarily very useful. So visualization is good for exploration. That's the case when you have some data and you have no idea what it is, and you're just trying to find out what it is. What are the patterns? What are the trends? What are the characteristics? Are there any outliers? What are the exceptions, and so on? So it's good for exploration. It's also good for analysis, and that applies to most of the people in this room. Analysis. This is when you're having a hypothesis and you collect data to either confirm your hypothesis or refute your hypothesis. And that's what most physicists do, most biochemists do, in most geographers, right? They collect data because they have a hypothesis, a question they want to answer. For example, a hypothesis is, I believe that the temperature of the Earth is increasing. Right? That's a hypothesis. So you spend millions and millions of pounds to collect data to confirm or refute that hypothesis. And this is also something that you all have to do. When you're finished analyzing, exploring and analyzing your data, you have to present it, right? In a research paper, for example, or at a conference, or to the general public, the whole world, for example. We are going to learn how to do that, how to present your findings to the entire world. And this is what most people think of when they think of visual data analysis and visualization. Visual data analysis and visualization can also accelerate something. So we can do things very quickly sometimes that we couldn't do otherwise, right? Some decisions can be reduced to a matter of just a few seconds. If we can see the data, somehow we can make decisions much more quickly. Then a trivial example is, imagine you have a spreadsheet with 10,000 numbers. If you plotted those 10,000 numbers as a bar chart, you can imagine us scrolling back and forth and looking at a bar chart. And I asked you a question, which value is the highest? Right? You have the option of the bar chart, looking at the bar chart, or looking at the 10,000 numbers. Which one would you choose to look at to answer your question? The bar chart, right? You'd be able to answer that inside of a second or two with a bar chart. But I don't know how long it would take to answer that question if I just gave you the raw data, the 10,000 numbers. Well, you'd hit this, you'd have to use the sort functionality and all that stuff. But you wouldn't be able to use the sort functionality if the number of numbers is too large, right? That would no longer be a quick and easy option for in Excel, for example. Okay, so the rest of the lecture are actual examples of this. So I've been very abstract about the age of digital enlightenment. And now we're going to go through different examples from different disciplines, like physics and geography, computer science, mathematics, bioscience. So all the things in the College of Science, different. And we're going to formulate the examples in the context of the age of the digital enlightenment, this distinct steps that are characterized by the age of digital enlightenment, right? Starting with some goal, then proposing an analog solution, realizing the limitations of the analog solution, and therefore turning our focus to the promised land of the promised digital world, the software or digital solution, right? And this is just one example from physics. Of course, there are millions of examples from physics, but we're just going to have like one for each topic, right? Because we only have a limited amount of time. I can see the suspense on everybody's faces, the excitement, the anticipation, the level of anticipation of the examples. So here's an example from physics. This happens to be the study of foam, right? There are physicists that study the behavior of foam and try to understand the behavior of foam. This is one of the problems in physics. And you might think, oh, that's kind of odd. That's what I thought when I first heard about it. That, like, foam, that seems kind of odd to me. But actually, if we can increase our understanding of foam dynamics, it has a massive impact on the world, right? Because we all use foam every day, right? As a cleaning agent, for example. So the more a substance, the more foam it can create, the better it is at cleaning. Right? That's the goal of a lot of cleaning agents. But it's used for other things too, like firefighting. You can put out fires more effectively with foam than you can with just a standard liquid like water. And there's another one called mineral separation. So how you dig raw material out of the earth and then separate it into useful different minerals, right? Foam is used in that process. And it's estimated that something like 4% of the entire world's energy is spent just on mineral separation. So any advancements in foam understanding can have a huge impact globally. So there is an analog solution to studying foam and foam behavior. Right? This is a picture of foam, by the way, right? Bubbles. Foam, a network of foam bubbles. That's a digital picture. And this is the standard software solution that physicists use. But physicists also use an analog solution. Can anybody imagine what that might be? It's really funky, like if you've never looked at this before. But they also use experimental methods to study foam. They get two glass plates, right, very close together, a few millimeters apart. They squeeze the foam between the glass plates, and then they use optical methods to study a single layer of foam as it moves across the space. That's not easy. You can imagine that's not an easy experiment to perform, right? To squeeze the foam between two glass plates and then just take out a camera and film it and hope that you learn things from that. That's really challenging. And it's very expensive. So they look into simulation methods. Because the analog solution, which they do work on, by the way, they do work on analog solutions. They're just very expensive, tedious, and error prone, and they are limited. They're very limited because as soon as your layer gets thick, it becomes very, very difficult to see multiple layers of foam. So they also work on digital solutions, and they visualize the behavior of the foam in these skeletonized views where each bubble is represented by this outline. And they come up with visualizations that look like this, for example. This is foam as it's being pushed through a constriction, and then it expands again and comes out the other side. And this is a time-averaged visualization of the velocity over all time steps, which is not, it's informative, but it could be better. So physicists asked us if we could help them, right, with some more advanced visualization methods. Right, this is the standard visualization of foam to try to understand foam behavior. Right, to try to understand. Now that was interesting, wasn't that? The animation that showed the foam being pushed from left to right through the constriction. This is a standard visualization, right? But it's very challenging at the same time, isn't it? So if I said, can you tell me what's happening as a quiz question, you probably would feel uncomfortable answering that question based on that animation, right? Because it's very difficult.
So is the animation based on an algorithm, or is it still on an observational basis?
It's based on an algorithm. Yeah, the motion of individual bubbles. Yeah. It's difficult. It's difficult. And this is the standard way to visualize the foam, right? Using these skeletonized views. You can learn things about the foam if you stare at those animations long enough. But it's difficult. So we try to create some visualization software that helps us understand the foam dynamics in a better way, right, than watching the skeletonized views or the time averaged graph on the right, because none of those visualizations are not interactive. Right? You cannot interact with those visualizations in any way. They're static. So this is some foam visualization software. And this is the user mapping the foam bubbles to color. So this is the x velocity, right? The velocity moving along, x being mapped to color, right? So high velocity and low velocity, right? For example. So here we can see where the high. So that's something you cannot see from the skeletonized views already, right? If I said where are the high velocity bubbles and where are the low velocity bubbles with the skeletonized view, you wouldn't know the answer. You just couldn't tell. With visualization, an interactive visualization system though, you can tell, okay, where are the high velocity bubbles and where are the low velocity bubbles. One of the first features that the physicists asked for was the ability to visualize the path that a bubble traverses along its way. Right? Where do the bubbles go? And so that's a visualization of all the bubble paths, right, at the same time. So that's the skeletonized view color mapped, and that's the visualization of all the center paths. Right? And this is the user interacting with the software. Analyzing the simulation data. And as soon as we zoom in on the paths, we notice a pattern that we couldn't see before. And that the cycles. So all of these bubbles traverse loops or have a cyclical behavior, right, that shows up as soon as you apply some visualization methods to the data, which you just couldn't see before. Right? So this is a zoomed out view. And this rectangle is the magnified view here. So we have an overview visualization, and then we have the magnified view on the right. This is also called the context view, which is why the context is checked off there. So we know for the first time that bubbles traverse loops, and that's just one bubble. These are two sedimenting disks, so they're disks that are being dropped into the foam and just released to see what happens. Right. And this is the average velocity of the foam bubbles over time. So with each time step, the average is updated. Right? We have high velocity and low velocity. And one of the questions is why, at what distance do the two sedimenting disks interact? Right? If they're pulled apart far enough, they don't interact. And the question is, well, at what distance do they start to interact with each other? And this is an alternative visualization. That's sort of a kind of a standard coordinate system. But these visualizations have a coordinate system centered around the rear disk, so the rest of the world moves around the rear disks, so we can study the interaction between the disks. And that's an example from physics. It looks like there are lots of people from geography here today. So we have an example from geography as well. Anybody curious about the geography one? I would think that you'd be very curious about the geography one. It's a good topic. I really like geography. Some of you might know or be slightly familiar with this already. So the goal in this case is understanding the public health of England or the UK. Right? There's an institute called the NHS that everybody probably has heard of, and they're interested in looking after our health, and we hope that they do a good job. Well, that's a serious data management problem right there, the NHS. That's a non-trivial data analysis problem. So the goal is to understand public health. There is an analog solution to that goal if you're working with the NHS, and that's just to hire more staff, hire more nurses, hire more doctors, if we want to improve the public's health. But there is a limit to the number of doctors and nurses we could hire. Like the ideal solution would be that everybody had their own personal health assistant, right? That would be the ideal solution. And we could just directly talk to our personal health assistant and keep ourselves healthy. That's not very practical though. So it's very obvious for the NHS to collect data, and they collect a lot of it, right? And every time you visit the NHS, they collect your data. They often give you a diagnosis, like maybe you have coronary heart disease. Probably most people here don't have that yet. Hypertension is very common, so high blood pressure. You can get a diagnosis, mental disorder, right, or cancer, right? You can get lots of different diagnoses. These diagnoses are collected into a database, and they're anonymized, they're aggregated into groups, and then the data is released to the public, right? Because the NHS is hoping that somebody can help them understand that massive collection of data, because it's so complicated. So they collect and collect and collect, right? Millions of diagnoses, right, of multivariate data. And one of the challenges is to couple it with the geography. That's where the geography comes in. This is a typical visualization that they use, right? It's got cancer on one axis, right? Cancer rate on one axis, and then something like time on the other axis. The axes are a little bit too small for me to read, but that's a standard kind of visualization for this data. But it would be nice if it was coupled somehow to a map, right? So we could see where things are happening. Where, for example, are the most cancer diagnoses? That would be an interesting question to ask, right? We don't know that necessarily from a visualization, a standard visualization like this. This is a standard kind of map, right? And this happens to show the different CCGs. Anybody know what a CCG is? Any of the geography people? It's a clinical commissioning group. And those are the divisions, the NHS divisions. That's how the NHS is divided up into different groups. They're called clinical commissioning groups. And that's what they look like. These are the different clinical commissioning groups. So you can see like Cornwall has a very big one down here. Anybody from this one in the audience? And then in London, they're all bunched together, right? Because it's so densely populated. So there are like 20 or 30 clinical commissioning groups all bunched together in London. So if I just ask the question, okay, where's the most cancer diagnoses, it would be difficult doing that, looking at a standard map, because it's not evenly distributed, right? It's not distributed in an information-friendly way. I can't see what's happening in London. I can't really see what's happening in Birmingham. And it gets even worse if we try to visualize multiple variables at the same time. Like, there are more than just cancer diagnoses. There are mental health disorder diagnoses. There are at least 4 different kinds of cardiovascular disease diagnoses. Right? There's hypertension, high blood pressure, kidney disease, So if you're trying to visualize all of these different diagnoses at the same time, it becomes basically impossible with a visualization like that, like the standard map. Because the standard map usually shows only one variable at a time. Has anybody heard of a cartogram before? So a cartogram is an alternative to the standard map. And that's when the areas change size according to some variable. So the area of one of the CCGs, instead of being mapped to the space, it could be mapped to cancer rate. So it could increase with high cancer diagnoses or decrease in shape with small diagnoses, small rates of diagnosis. And then if we try to do it for multiple variables, it could look something like this, right? This is the space, the UK space, being divided up into equal chunks of equal size that we can see, and then there's a height here, right? And the colors are different variants or different variables. So this is an example of a kind of three-dimensional cartogram. But that also has challenges too, right? Because I still can't see what's really going on in London. I can see there's something going on in London, but it's hard to see what's happening in London. And it's kind of hard to see what's happening in Birmingham too, because of occlusion. So a 2D solution, something that's like a mixture of maybe this and this, some combination might be useful. Another observation is that if we're looking at the UK has a very awkward shape. Has anybody ever noticed that? If you're trying to visualize something. Does anybody have a map of the UK? I have a map. It's awkward, isn't it? Mine is cut in half. So like the paper one, it's cut like right here, and there's a bottom on one side, and then the other side has the top half. But if you can get the whole UK on one sheet, on one rectangle, it only occupies about 20% of the actual space in that rectangle. It's a very awkward shape. Right? If you try to print it on A4 or something, or A3, it will only occupy 20% of the space because it's long and kind of awkward. So it would be nice if we could make more efficient use of the space too. So we want to make efficient use of the space. We want to preserve the geospatial relationships, but we also want to visualize multiple variables or multiple diagnoses. We have all these challenges all at the same time. So we can use visualization to try to address that. So, for example, a multivariate cartogram might be useful. A two-dimensional multivariate cartogram. That's what we're going to see a demo of, right? Oh, that's the wrong one.
Are you using a demo that is already in existence, or you can do that on your own?
This is something we're working on at Swansea University in computer science.
Any chance you might disclose the...
Yeah, we are very happy to we don't have like somebody in geography yet that's interested in that, but if you know somebody, we're more than happy to talk to them. Definitely. We know physicists, we know bioscientists, we know people from all the other departments, but not geography. So this is an attempt to solve all of those problems at the same time. And it's a modified version of a cartogram. So what we're seeing now, these are all the CCGs, right, in their original positions. We can see the space is not being used very efficiently. So we have an algorithm that blows them up, right, and spreads out the information. but tries to also preserve the neighborhood relationships, which means neighbors that are a west neighbor always is a west neighbor no matter what. Right? Likewise for the east neighbor, or the southern neighbors, or the northern neighbors. The relative position always is maintained, even though the areas expand and make use of space, right? So this shows some variations on that theme, right, of the areas. And the user has control over how much space they want to use, right? So this is a version of the UK that uses a lot of space, but you can see there's a trade-off because Scotland or that northern region gets distorted. So the more space we use up, the more distorted the geography becomes. So it's a trade-off. But in this application, the user has explicit control over the trade-off. They can decide, oh, I want to use up this much space, but I have this error tolerance.
And the empty spaces are all
The empty spaces are, well, they're nothing. They're water. And they correspond to water in geography. The white space. In between is nothing. That's right. That's right. Yeah. Now the multivariates. Now the different colors. Now inside each region node. So that's a CCG region. We have the different diagnoses. So coronary heart disease, heart failure, stroke, chronic kidney disease, diabetes, hypertension, mental health disorder, osteoporosis, arthritis, epilepsy, all of our favorite diagnoses, right, inside of each CCG. And it's a lot of information. It's a lot of information coupled with the geospatial position. Now, it's a lot of information, but even now we can already make some observations before we go even further. Like, for example, hypertension is a huge problem in the UK. That's the #1 diagnosis. And I can see that immediately. I can see it in a few seconds. Hypertension, number one diagnosis everywhere. And then I can make another observation. Diabetes is #2. Big problem. I can see that right away with this kind of, and it's not about any special region of the UK. It's a problem everywhere, right? So I can make, even with that crazy amount of information, I can already start making observations, immediately. But we can make more observations, and we will. So the user has control. This is just a demonstration of the user playing with the settings that control the size that each node takes in the space.
This small squares, it's called glyphs.
Yeah, you could think of it as glyphs, but actually each one of these is called a tree map. Yeah. So inside of each CCG node is a tree map. So this version of the software, the rectangles are different sizes. In this, the user is basically what we're doing now is just showing the different user options built into the software. This one is saying, okay, show me the different CCGs based on their local population, the population that they serve. And already it's very unexpected, right? What I expected is to see London, like the CCGs in London being very big, like serving a large, dense population. But that's not true. The biggest CCG is over in Cornwall, right? And there's a big one over in the northeast, right? Probably in the Hull region, right? Which is unexpected. And what can we learn from that? We can learn something important from that, right?
May I sum the PCC?
They have to travel further to get help.
Exactly, yes. So the money, you learn something about the budget. So the budget here is less than the budget here. So the allocation of money is not evenly distributed. And there may be good reasons for that, right? There probably are good reasons for that. It would be interesting to find out why. You know, that's the user playing with the different space parameters that decide how much space we want to occupy on the screen. This is grouping the CCGs together into a hierarchy. So now we have several CCGs together in a larger kind of hierarchy. That's a group of CCGs. This is one CCG, so you can click on any of these and get a zoomed in view of the diagnoses. And what is this example? This is showing, okay, this is the user interactively controlling the layout. So stepping through the layout one step at a time instead of automatically animating it. This helps us understand the relative geospatial location of each CCG. Right? If we just showed the end result, it would be harder to understand where everything is located. So we have some more. We have lots of different user options in there because there's so much information being presented at the same time. It's good to have ways to filter it and navigate it somehow. Right? So we know that there's geospatial error being introduced. We can actually visualize the error, right? And if we connect the lines that show the distortion, right? We can actually visualize the error. So those lines are visualizing the distortion or the error that we introduce in the geospatial locations when we start moving the CCGs around. So this is just playing with different color maps, right? Because it's hard to decide which color map to use, right? When you have, for example, 14 different variables. And this is the user just playing with the different color maps, showing the different options, shading the colors or adding shading to the rectangles, for example. So these are ways to filter the data. So this, for example, says, show me all of the diagnoses or all of the regions with an above average diagnosis. So so now we can see, okay, which regions have diagnoses that occur above the average. The UK has an average. And immediately we can see two things. The London region is healthier overall than the rest of the UK. We can see some of the CCGs in the north that are exceptionally below average in terms of health. And then in London, for example, we can see two exceptions though. Mental health is above average diagnosis, right? And what's the pink one? Diabetes. So we can immediately make some observations based on these different filtering options. Right, and that's the below average filter.
And do you feed the data for that into the same software?
The data is public. So it's available from Public Health England. It's in the slides actually.
Yeah, so but if you want to establish, I only want to see the above average diagnoses, the program will have to know where do I check what average is and then.
That's right. That's right. The program has to check that to compute the average and then compare against the average. Yeah.
It works with the same. It works with the same program.
Yeah, yeah. This is a program we're developing in the computer science department. Yeah, yeah. Okay, I see we're running out of time, so I'm going to stop this one short. You can see the video is on YouTube. You all have a link to the YouTube. Actually, we're not going to have time for this part. Okay, I'll maybe just quickly show the example. Anybody have a preference? We have a chemistry example and a bioscience example. Anybody have any preferences? Bioscience. I think some of you may have seen that already. Okay, I forgot. Let's see. This is just an example from biochemistry or computational biology, sorry. So there are lots of computational biologists. There's a huge group of like 50 people at Oxford University just doing computational biology. And they asked us if we could help them visualize their simulation data. So they study the motion of individual atoms and molecules, right? And they try to predict the behavior of, for example, proteins and lipids as they interact with each other, right? And that's a very challenging problem. So they asked us if we could help them. They know that visualization is important already. They know they have a data chaos problem already. It's already a well-established approach. Visualization is already a well-established approach in the field of computational biology. So this is also software that we're working on to visualize computational biology data. And these are the paths of individual molecules, lipids and proteins. Right, and that's what we're visualizing here on an interactive program. So we can take these trajectories and filter them by different properties. For example, show me all the trajectories or the paths that are the longest. Right, that's what the user is. Adjusting this filter from short paths to the longest paths interactively. Right, that's what that filter is doing. And that's showing all the paths. This is filtering the paths based on curvature. So quantifying the curvature of the individual paths and then saying, okay, I'd like to see all the paths with the highest curvature. That's what we're adjusting right now. So these are all the paths with the highest curvature. And then we're sliding it across until we get to the lowest curvature, for example. Right? And as soon as we add these kind of filters, we can see patterns jumping out, right, of the mass of trajectories, right? This is a variation of the curvature filter, right? This is normalized curvature. That means the total curvature divided by the length of the trajectory, or an average curvature, right? Rather than total curvature. So one of the patterns you can see are the holes, right? So the holes appear. Those are the proteins. that's not something that's really understandable unless you have a little bit of a more background. It's not going to be. There's nobody doing computational biology in the audience, right? But studying the motion of individual atoms and molecules is something that's very interesting for physicists, right? Because you have Swansea University has a lot of particle physicists, right? Like Simon Hans, for example, right? Did any of you guys have Simon Hans? Do you know Simon Hans, physicist back there? He's a good guy to know. Yeah. Okay, I think we're going to stop there. We did run out of time, but it's okay. All of the examples are on YouTube if you want to look at them again. Right, they're all there. Also, next time is very unusual again. So next time, if you want, you can bring a laptop, and we're going to use some visualization software, some freely available visualization software. You can just bring your laptop, install it, and I'm going to give a live demo of that software right here. Yeah, so that's going to be exciting. Yeah. Happy Thursday.